So hi there, and welcome to Poetry Passages. I'm Clifford Rames, and how great it is to have my special guest with me here today, Clint Margrave. Hi, Clint. How you doing?
Good. How you doing, Clifford?
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the program. So Clint is a poet and novelist, and his new book, Visitor, has just come out, published by NYQ Books. When did this come out? It was recently, right?
October, yeah.
October.
The end of October.
Yeah, cool. So I have to say, I really enjoyed the book. I mean, I kind of just like careened through here and then went back and looked at some others, and there's not a clunker in here, I'll have to tell you.
Thank you.
You may disagree,
I
but
don't
I
know
think
if I agree with that.
I loved
I'm
every
glad to
single
hear
one.
it anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved everyone. I have my some favorites that we might get to, but yeah, congratulations. Good job.
Thank you.
So before we dive deeper into the book, I also want to mention that you are also the author of two other collections, Salute to the Wreckage, right, which I have right there, and The Early Death of Men, which I have right there. And you've also written a novel, right?
Yes.
You want
Uh,
to tell us about it
called,
quick?
called Lying Bastard.
Lion Bastard.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Uh, anything about it you want to tell us
Anything
about?
about it?
What's it about?
It's narrated by a professor who's playing dead on the classroom floor after a school shooting. So it's a dark humor. And gets kind of roped into um, this situation with this student where he's on the verge of committing a crime, and I won't give anything else away.
By the book.
But yeah, it's a satire. It
Yeah.
sounds very serious, but it's more of a satire.
Well, you mentioned dark humor, and that's definitely something I wanted to talk about because there's a lot of that in this book as well. But we'll get to that. One thing I did want to mention, which I found really helpful, I didn't notice it right away, but I noticed it later, that the poems are in alphabetical order. So I was like, wait a minute. So yeah, the poems that start with A and it goes through W or something. So that made it really easy to go back and find the ones that I really wanted to read again. So that's kind of cool. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, I've been enjoying that myself. Definitely readings now, and for once I can find the poem. So
It makes it easier, right? Yeah.
the story behind that is that uh, one, I just not really big on organizing poetry books, and I don't read poetry books from front to back ever.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, maybe occasionally, if it's especially if it's like something that's supposed to be a long narrative, but in general, I don't. So I flip through them at
Yeah.
random. Um, so I just started thinking, what, is it? I don't know. Is it? Do I really need to organize it in a particular way? And then I found that doing it alphabetically created these strange connections between poems at times. And so I found that was really interesting. And I'm not the type that likes to organize a poetry book by theme or something like that. I find that gets really boring and
Yeah.
just flattens out everything. So I like a little more randomness there. And somebody had suggested it to me, and I thought, oh, that's a good idea.
I think,
Actually,
yeah.
it was somebody who was, I was having to take a look at the poems for the manuscript, and I hadn't put them in any order yet. And I sent them to him just like out of my files alphabetically. And he thought that was the order. He's like, the alphabetical order is working really well. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. Well, that wasn't intentional. But then I thought, well, this is one of those beautiful accidents. So
Well,
let's
well,
leave
like I
it.
said, I didn't even notice it right away. And I read my first sitting, I read it front to back, straight through, and then I kind of went back flipping through. And that's when I noticed it. But so reading it the first time straight through, it never occurred to me that there was an order or a disorder. It just seemed to flow. And like you said, there were these odd connections, but it was kind of like almost like being in a bumper car, and but in a pleasant way. You're laughing out loud as you turn the page, and then crying, and then sighing, and then and
Yeah, I think there's a secret in the alphabetical order.
I think you're onto
The
something,
universe has provided
Margrave.
this. Yeah.
Well, anyway, sorry, I also wanted to say it's like great to finally meet you because I first came across you like 2 years ago and we connected on social media and I've been following your work. But the first connection came through your poem, Toad Dies and Goes to Heaven, which was first published, I think, in Rattle, right? Rattle magazine
Yes.
about 2 years ago. And that's when I saw it and I really, really liked it. I hadn't heard of you. And I said, like, who's this guy, Clint Margrave? And so I looked into you and picked up a couple of your books. And then I read Toad on a previous Poetry Passages episode. I think it was number 55. And yeah, but then when I heard you had a new book coming out, I was like, I want to get this, I want to get him on. Yeah.
Great to be here. Yeah.
So would you like to read Toad for us?
Yeah. Why don't
And
I start with
I'm
that?
so glad to see that it wasn't Rattle, but now it's made it into the new book.
Yeah, the book had been accepted. The manuscript had already been accepted before this poem was written, and
Really?
I ended up having them include it. There's this poem and at least one other poem.
That you kind of slipped in at the
So,
last minute. Yeah.
yeah, so I was glad to get it in there.
Yeah.
All right, this is called "Toad Dies and Goes to Heaven," in memory of Gerald Locklin, 1941 to 2021. Nobody is more surprised than he is. First of all, Toad doesn't believe in heaven. And secondly, even if he did, he never expected to visit. In fact, he's minorly disappointed. Has he failed to achieve the properly debauched life he so often courted? But the food tastes good, and you can drink all the frothy beer you want and never have to go to the bathroom. The salads are made just the way he likes them, too, with lots of crunchy iceberg lettuce and a good Roquefort dressing. But who is he kidding? Nobody eats salads here. At least there aren't any pearly gates or saints with halos, just a dive bar with a few pretty angels. They even have a poetry night. And though the audience is dead and the open mic literally goes on forever, this time it isn't annoying, but filled with names like Dante and Homer and Shakespeare and Szymborska. Hello, Toad, says his old pal Bukowski, who approaches the bar and pulls up a stool. Good to see you again, Hank, says Toad, as they clink their glasses and take a drink, not to their health, but ours.
Wonderful. I think we can add a few more names to that list. I can now Charles
Yeah,
Charles
right.
Simic walking into the bar and telling a, a dark joke of some sort.
Yeah.
So you dedicated that to Gerald Locklin, who you knew, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Was he a
Uh,
mentor of yours or?
he was a mentor and a friend. Yeah. I first, let's see. I found his writing before I ever knew him, and he was here at Cal State Long Beach, where I teach now. But at the time, I was just working in a bookstore in Long Beach, and I was kind of a school dropout, not high school, a college dropout, and was already writing and deciding what, I had some crazy idea. Oh, I'll just work at a bookstore and write. And that's all I need to do my whole life, right? Bookstores will be around. Eventually I decided to go to school. But anyway, I did seek him out though eventually at Cal State Long Beach, and they have a creative writing program there. And though I didn't major in creative writing, I majored in comparative literature.
Mm,
But I went there because he was there, and a couple other people. Stephen Cooper, who was John Fonte's biographer, was there, and I was a big fan of Bukowski and John Fonte and Lachlan. And before that, I had been publishing a few poems. I had published a few poems in the Chiron Review, which Lachlan was the editor for. And so the first time I met him was actually I was working as a cashier at Borders Bookstore, right, in Long Beach. And he came up to the counter and I said, oh, you're Gerald Locklin, I'm a big fan of your writing. And he was just very like, oh, thank you, kind of shy. And so then I would see him regularly in the bookstore. And for a long time, he thought my name was Jim. So he'd always be like, "Oh, hi, Jim. How you doing, Jim?" But later on, I just thought it was so funny. And
That's great.
then eventually, I went to the college, and I was too afraid to take a poetry class with him at the time, so I ended up just taking a random class with that he was teaching, which was contemporary literary theory,
Mm.
and and then I ended up doing some independent study with him through that time, and then
Okay,
much later, we became better friends, and
sure.
um,
Did he stop calling you Jim at some point?
he stopped calling at some point. Yes, he stopped calling me Jim.
That became a pretty good joke between you, though. Like,
Actually, I don't think I ever told him about it. So
oh, really?
yeah, it's kind of just it makes me laugh now. I think I had forgotten, for a while, but
Well,
yeah.
so it got me thinking because you're both from Long Beach, and there seems to be a pretty vibrant poetry scene in Long Beach. So I was wondering, is there actually a Long Beach school of poetry? I mean, we've heard of the
There
New York
used to
School of
be.
Poetry,
There
but there
used to
used to
be. I
be.
feel like it's kind of, at the moment, and with the death of Lachlan, and a lot has changed in the past 10 years. But I think really through the 80s and the 90s, and then there was a little resurgence around 2010. There is this sort of school of Long Beach that I think is connected to, we also have Charles Webb is at the school. And Charles Webb's anthology stand-up poetry. Are you familiar with that at all?
No. Mm-mm.
Um, so this idea of, I think that's the kind of stuff you would like. And it's, you had Billy Collins on, and he did mention Lachlan, I heard, but this idea of stand-up poetry being humorous, humorous poetry that's accessible and clear, um, poetry readings that are actually kind of fun and not just drab, and just so I think Lachlan and people like Edward Field actually I think Lachlan and Webb got the idea of stand-up poetry from an Edward Field book, which I think was called Stand Up Friends.
Mm.
Edward Field being on the East Coast, but they were friends, and a lot of that just took over in Long Beach. There was a really vibrant scene, much of which I missed in the early days, and then
Mm.
I think really through the 80s and 90s, and they have an MFA program at Cal State Long Beach that Lachlan ran. And so that they would get a lot of writers in there through that. And there
Mm.
used to just be a lot of places to read and a lot of bookstores. Of course, everything's changing, and bookstores are gone and
Yeah,
people are
yeah.
gone.
Um,
So now, and then there's the pandemic, so now there's not much going on, but
sure.
hopefully that'll come back.
So do you see your poetry as being sort of leaning more towards the Long Beach school or some other school, maybe like the New York school, or where do you kind of see yourself fitting in? Because I know that, for example, the New York school, it's famous for its kind of anti-establishment, anti-academic attitudes, its witty sarcasms and sort of commentary on the arts and pop culture, and all through kind of humor or sarcasm. And I see a lot of that in some of your work, especially in this last book, Visitor. What would you say to that?
I don't associate with any school necessarily, but not even the school I went or work at. No, but I think
I
there's
think
a
there's a poem
connection
about
there.
that in the book.
Yeah, the way you describe, the New York school and kind of the Long Beach thing, they might be way different style wise, but I think it all is one, that all everyone's influenced by everything, right? So no doubt there's probably influence that was taken. Then I was influenced by some of the people here in Long Beach. I mean, certainly it's part of me. I mean, I grew up in Long Beach, LA, so we all love Bukowski. Bukowski would be very humorous, and so it was just I never thought about it actually until recently. I was always one of those. I didn't. People would ask me about the effect of place on my work, and I just would kind of shrug, because I'm also so into a lot of European, poets and things like
Right.
that. So,
Yeah, and that
uh,
definitely comes through in the book. I mean, there's no real sense of place. I mean, there's a couple of LA poems. You have a couple poems set
yeah,
in Bulgaria, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
But there's more connection to literary themes and sort of journeys of the soul through certain and journeys of these historical figures. I'm going to talk about that, but right now, would you like to read just a couple more poems so we can?
Yeah. Is there any, did you have anything in mind or, I mean, I do have a couple that I,
Nothing really. If you something that kind of like is a hallmark of your style right now, or where you think are the book
okay.
kind of really sets the tone for the book, maybe.
Hmm.
I know it's a tall request.
That's challenging.
I
You
mean,
know, I
there's so
just
many
threw it
good
all
ones.
together
Like,
alphabetically. So, well, I don't know. I could read something humorous or
let me see. I can see. How about Aliens? That's a good one.
that's what I thought of that actually. But then when you said representative of my style, I don't know. Is it Aliens is the other poem that I wrote after the manuscript had been accepted.
And you slipped it in. Yeah.
Yeah, so I I still like it. It's a newer poem at least.
Cool.
So yeah, okay, I'll read that.
Aliens.
Aliens. And plus it was already called Visitor. And I thought, well, I gotta have an aliens poem in there. I mean,
And it's
it,
right at the front, so it kind of sets
it
the
was
tone
yeah,
for
it
the
was the
title.
one
Yeah.
thing that was missing, from the aliens. Even if they exist, we are still alone. Not like they're going to invite us to any of their parties or read any of our books. Besides, some friends only make contact when they want something. Maybe they tried calling already and we didn't get the message. Maybe they're just not talking to us right now, mad over some spilled secret about the universe they tried to keep hidden. Maybe they have big bang egos, an inflated sense of self, jealous they can travel through space and still not get anywhere. Maybe they don't reach out because they're sadder than us, more insecure, more fragile, more distant, more alien to themselves.
I like that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, so there is a lot of your poems, and we'll get to a couple more in a minute, but a lot of your poems, I on one hand they seem cynical, satirical, with touches of absurdism and some dark humor interspersed, but you're a tricky one, Clint Margrave. You're sly because there's also this undercurrent of sadness. There's undercurrent of um, tenderness. There's a lot of tenderness, and that poem is very tender. But there's also disappointment, right? There's a lot of disappointment, and I was thinking about that. I mean, you can't have disappointment without optimism, right? Isn't disappointment sort of the failure of optimism to live up to a standard? And so there's your disappointment in this book. There's optimism in there. You may not want to admit it, but I got some. Am I reading too much into this?
No, I'm actually. I think you're absolutely right. I always tell people, I'm actually a really optimistic person. I'm not, I don't mope around. I don't go around just feeling sorry for myself or the world. So I'm actually glad that you see that in there because
Yeah,
that's exactly how I feel. I don't feel, I mean, yes, life can be sad and there's disappointment and all of
yeah,
those things, but it can also be beautiful and the absurdity is not, the absurdity in life is something also to laugh at and not just let it break you, right?
yeah.
So I think all of those things, yeah,
Yeah.
I do feel in that way.
And like I said, there were poems in here that made me laugh out loud, and there were others that I found were really touching and tender. What are some of the themes that you would say you touch upon in this book? I mean, I heard you say, I think in the recent Rattlecast, that death is one of your big obsessions in poetry. But what are other than death, and we'll talk about that. What are some of your other themes?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, death too often. Not because I'm depressed about death or anything, just I exist, so I'm worried about it. But
Yeah, and
you know, and I think in this book it's interesting that maybe more than I've done in other books. For some reason, I think there's a lot of commentary about other writers, and whether it's imagining some scenario, So I think that was a theme that comes up repeatedly is sort of this imagining some narrative about some writer, or taking a historical element and then going with that, or literary characters. So there was a lot of that in this book, and none of that's planned. It's just seemed to be some obsession that I kept going back to writing these kind of poems. But there's also a number of ekphrastic poems in there that I've really gotten into. I think that was inspired definitely by Lachlan because I always have been a big fan of his ekphrastic poems. So yeah, I think there's poems about art, poems about literature, are some of the other themes.
I love
Relationships, too.
I love the Bruegel poem, The Fall of the
Oh
Road.
yeah,
So yeah, that's a good one. Well,
thank you.
I noticed that you have these you kind of you do have this focus on some historical figures from the art world, figures from literature. And you mentioned earlier you studied comparative literature, so that kind of explains a little bit. But a lot of these historical figures, you don't really let them lie in their graves in peace. You resurrect them, you kind of transport them or unstick them in time, as Vonnegut would say, and place them in sort of some modern situation or somehow in your life. And the effect is very humorous at times. Can you talk about? I mean, you started to talk about that, but I want to hear a little bit more about that.
About how intentional that is,
Or
or
just how that happens. Like, how are these figures so often on your mind and end up in your poetry?
yeah, I mean, I'm an avid reader, so as you would assume any poet or writer should be, right? But I read a lot of novels and fiction, and I always have. So I don't just stick with the poetry. There's probably actually less. I don't even know if there are any poems about poets now that I think about it.
No,
There might be, but they're all about
they're
novelists
writers.
generally, or yeah.
Camus.
What's that?
Camus is in there.
Yeah,
Dostoevsky is in
exactly.
there.
Yeah.
I love the
Um,
Dostoevsky on the subway poem. I love it.
yeah. I don't know where sometimes where these things. Honestly, I don't know where the hell they come from sometimes, but
Actually, could you
uh,
read that one?
yeah, sure. Actually, this one I think was inspired by something I saw online.
Really?
There was a picture of some guy with a beard. I think somebody even commented about something of Dostoevsky on a metro somewhere. So I just imagined that. I don't know why okay, I found it. Alphabetical is the way to go. All right, so this is called Dostoevsky Takes a Selfie. I'm not surprised to find him in the underground, but I am surprised to find him in LA. He sits across from me on the metro in shorts and tennis shoes, taking a selfie. I want to ask him what he's doing here. Too much sun for so much beard. Then again, as a writer of the dispossessed, the clinically insane, the suicidal, it just might be the place.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people can relate to this poem because anytime you ride the New York City subway, you can see any number of Dostoevsky characters.
Try the LA subway, which we do have an LA subway metro.
Not as famous, but I'm sure equally as interesting.
And I was taking it quite a bit because I was living in Los Feliz and my girlfriend worked downtown, so we were right by the train station, and I could just hop on and be there in 5 minutes. And yeah, it's quite an experience, the LA metro. So I don't know all that stuff. It sits in there somewhere, and
Yeah,
it
yeah, yeah.
comes out at some point.
Well, and on the theme of these characters, is there another one you would like to read? I mean, the ones I kind of really remember are the Meursault from Camus is the Stranger as an indifferent college
Oh yeah,
professor,
I could do that one.
or Gregor Samsa from Kafka's Metamorphoses gets canceled by a Twitter mob. I
That was.
love that one too.
Let me do the Meursault one
Want
since
to do the Meursault one? Cool.
it does touch on, I guess, another theme. Some that a little bit here is my job as a teacher. So
Yeah.
so that's here. Meursault gets a job as an adjunct English teacher professor. It doesn't matter if he forgets sometimes how to speak English, slips back into French, because he doesn't say much anyway. just stares at the class while his mind drifts off across the Mediterranean to that beach in Algiers, or the softness of Marie's hair, or how the ocean breeze once felt on his skin. Aren't you going to pass out the syllabus? A student finally asks at the third meeting. Meursault shrugs. It doesn't matter, he says, but I could if you'd like. Another student raises her hand and wants to know about his absence policy. Absence is the only policy, Meursault says, before he kicks his feet up on the desk and reaches in his blazer pocket for a cigarette.
I love it. That little touch at the end with the cigarette is the sort of the indifferent defiance, right?
There was a day when you could smoke in the classroom. Not when I.
It's a day.
We
Yeah.
have in one of my classrooms for a long time. There was still a sign up in the classroom that said "smoking by unanimous consent."
How'd that work out?
Oh, I don't think we were gonna do it, but it was left from the '70s or something. So
Right, right, right. Um, so yeah, so as I said that, I kind of I sat down and I just sort of reading furiously one after the other just to get an impression, and then I went back. But kind of, I don't know. As I read this book, I couldn't help but think of Voltaire's Candide. Don't ask me why, but there's sort of this. You know the book, right? Have you read it?
yeah,
I'm sure
yeah.
you. Yeah, yeah.
It's been a
So
while. But yeah,
it's been a while, yeah. So it's a series of crazy, absurd tragedies and these sort of ironic twists of fate and sort of absurd reversals of fortune that take place chapter after chapter after chapter. And I kind of, as I blew through this book, I kind of felt like that sort of, and I said it was going to be lurched from poem to poem, but in a very sort of fun and delightful way. Do you ever, have you thought about that? I mean, do you see yourself as a Voltaire poet?
wow. No, I've never thought that before.
I mean, did
I
you,
mean, the Candide thing is right. There's this overly like satirical optimism, right?
right, right. And well, that's the whole story. It's this sort of play between tragedy and optimism. You have the character played by Pangloss, who's the
Yeah,
ever optimist, who keeps talking about there can be a better world. We can have our best world.
right.
And then there's just terrible series of mishaps that keep
Yeah,
happening along the way as these two travel together.
yeah,
Um, and so there's a lot of that in this book. Would you
yeah. I
disagree?
mean, I'm thinking about the end of that book. Isn't it something about cultivating your garden, or I think the last line of that book.
Yeah,
Um,
you have to cultivate your garden
yeah,
and
and thinking about some of the characters that I wrote about here, I guess Meursault, and then even the authors like Camus, Dostoevsky. I mean, makes me think of existentialism when I was a young man was very important to my life and still is. It's kind of out of fashion now for people, but I think that's a mistake because I think it really informed a lot of who I am. And so maybe to me that existentialism is rather optimistic. People mix it up with nihilism, but that's not really what it is. And
yeah,
so thinking about cultivating one's garden and sort of creating one's essence and all that.
yeah, yeah,
So maybe in that, but not you don't necessarily turn away and ignore tragedy or sugarcoat
right.
it or anything like that either. You're in this world, in this universe, in this position, and you have to cultivate something, right? I don't want to say you have to make good or anything like that, but you have to cultivate some kind of meaning out of it. So I think if there's any connection at all, I think it's that I'm always sort of searching for meaning, and maybe I do that in the writing. Some hopefully I guess.
Well, kind of fittingly, I think now that we're talking about the cultivating the garden scene at the end of Voltaire, where after everything they end up in this little huts with a small garden and this ideal world that they were looking for all around the world ended up being just a flower patch in their little backyard. But sort of that metaphor, I can almost apply that metaphor to the last poem in your book, kind of fittingly called Wood Carving Lesson.
Yeah.
And can you read that one and
Love to
see
read that one. Yeah, I
see
don't think I've
if
read
you're on
that
the
yet.
same page with me on this?
Yeah, this is a yeah wood carving lesson. Every time Mr. Stew says wood, I hear word. Word carving is the process of cutting and shaping of the word, he says with his thick Bulgarian accent. It is a craft with a rich history. He has set up a block of wood for our lesson today. He takes two screws and drills them to a base to keep the block steady. The type of word is very important, he says. Some word is softer than others, some more difficult to shape, but all word is alive. He shows me how to hold the chisel and how to apply pressure. I tap it with the hammer and carve a line into the block, like pen into paper.
Mm, I like it. There's something existential there as well, right?
Mm.
That oneness, wood, man, no, chisel on wood, pencil on paper. There's some more going on there than meets the eye. So, you mentioned the death as a theme, which I wanted to get back to. Um, and you have this wonderful poem in the book called Bulgarian Necrologues.
Mm-hmm.
One that kind of jumped out at me because I know what a necrologue is. I'm familiar with them, and I'll
Right.
mention it, talk about that in a second. But for people who don't know, can you explain what a necrologue is?
Um, so I think mostly Eastern Orthodox, right? But in Eastern Europe, I go to Bulgaria a lot. My girlfriend's Bulgarian, so they post up these, almost like obituaries, right? And so when somebody dies, they post it all over the city. So you'll see, you just see different. It's one of the first. If you've never been before, you don't know about it. It's um, you go, what are all these pictures of these people, and sometimes there'll be a cross and something's written, that you can't understand if you're a tourist and don't speak the language, right? So yeah, so it's sort of these death postings, and they change them. I think they change them. There's like one you post again after 40 days, and then a year later, so they continue. So yeah, that's essentially. I don't know if I'm defining it that well, but
Yeah. Well,
something.
so can you read this poem and then yeah, we'll talk more about it.
Yeah. Bulgarian Necrologues. Here, it's only natural to live among the dead. They watch from every street, in solemn commemorations printed on white sheets of paper, posted everywhere, on trees, at bus stops, tacked to doors, kiosks, or telephone poles, authored by family members to announce the passing of a grandfather or mother or aunt. Grainy photographs of the elderly or of a young man or woman, even a child, bordered by a simple black frame, birth and death dates beneath their image, some sad Cyrillic script that as a tourist I'm not supposed to understand, yet do. So many people missing in Sofia, says my Chilean friend, a fellow traveler who misinterprets the meaning, though missing just as well, from their husbands, from their wives, from their children, from their friends, from the dinner table. If I didn't know better, I might have mistaken these notices for wanted posters, in the way Bulgarians say other foreigners do, which is not really surprising since all the dead are fugitives.
What a great last line. I love it. So yeah, you have this connection to Bulgaria through your girlfriend, right? And
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I I also have a connection to the Balkans, and that's through my father to Croatia, where I also go a lot. And they also post these necrologues,
Mm-hmm.
which are kind of, when I first saw them, like you said, what is this,
Mm-hmm.
And then people gathered like at the corners or in city squares where they're posted and look and say, oh, look who went this time. And so
Mm-hmm.
they're death notices, right? With they just usually this little black and white picture and so and so passed on this day. and it reminded me of my uncle. I had an uncle in Croatia. His name was Boris, and the thing with Uncle Boris was he was always dying. Like for as long as I've known him, and that's more than 20 something, 30 years, he was dying. And every time I would leave to go back home to the States, he would say, "Well, this is the last time, well, you won't see me again," and we'd hug and farewell. And then, of course, next year I'd come back and there he was. And then it was the same story. Well, you won't see me again. Um, so finally, he actually did die, sadly. But when he died, I went to look at his little necrologue downtown, and there it was. It was real. He really did die this time. And he had this smile on his face in the picture, as though he was telling everyone, "I told you so."
That's funny. Yeah.
So it really it's as an American, and I got used to this idea of these necrologues, but it's really kind of really a whole different perspective on death than we as Americans have. We kind of like to keep it in the distance. It's very much part of life in these Bulgaria and Croatia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, that's something I noticed. Americans really try to hide death.
Yeah, buried in the back
You can't
pages.
hide them. They're posted everywhere. You see
Yeah,
them every day. You're walking through the streets of Sofia or something, and it's like
there's a new one.
you
Yeah,
can't go to work or you can't go anywhere without sort of seeing those and
yeah,
just sort of having a moment to reflect and
yeah. Even if
remember
you don't
that.
know them, you stop and you look at them and you say,
Yeah.
"Oh, he was young or she was old."
Yeah, you might not know the people, right? But you can, read it, and yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
sometimes it is terrible. You'll see like a young person, and
yeah, yeah,
oh gosh, but in another way, it's a tribute, and it's a way to remember, a way to me, a way to remember death is a way to remember life. Right? So, I don't, and maybe that's this optimism thing, but I do write about death a lot, and I do think about that a lot. But to me, it feeds into, uh, how much I value life, and just it just a good reminder to never take anything for granted. So just walking down the street, seeing those necrologues,
yeah.
uh, it's not it. Maybe some Americans, oh, it's depressing or something like. I don't think of it that way.
No,
I think it just it allows you to reflect
it's
and just
kind of
remember life.
life affirming because
Yeah, exactly.
you suddenly realize I'm still here. I'm here. I've made it through another day. This person
That
did.
too, yes. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're the one looking at the necrologue, then it's a good thing, right?
Yeah, and like I said, there's also the social aspect, which is so lovely. People gather and they start to tell stories about that person, and it becomes a social thing. And yeah, it's nice. I like it.
Yeah, yeah.
So you do have another well, I'm assuming it was written in Bulgaria or about Bulgaria, but you have another poem called "On the Banks of the Danube," which I really love. Which would you
Yeah.
mind reading that one?
Yeah, this is
A
it.
bit of
Okay,
a,
yeah.
it's a bit of a downer, but it's also very beautiful.
I can talk. I guess we'll talk about it after I read it. So let me I
Yeah,
just found out something about it this week. So let me read.
really. Is it okay to read it? You feel comfortable reading it?
Oh yeah. No,
Yeah.
I'll read the poem and then I'll tell you what I heard this week. So
Okay.
which I didn't know about. This is called "On the Banks of the Danube." On the banks of the Danube, they found the young mother's body. And all I could think about were the fields of sunflowers that went on for miles when I traveled through Bulgaria last summer. The red roofs of village houses, the shopkeepers that sat smoking together on busy streets in perfectly timed cigarette breaks. The devoted young friends I made staging art exhibits in the center of cities. The father who kept kissing the cheek of his disabled daughter each time he wiped the drool from her mouth. The boy ringing the bell on his bicycle. The parents who carried their paraplegic son onto a raft in the Black Sea so he could swim with his brothers and sisters. The melon ice cream in the park on Saturday. The little girl running across grass in bright pink pants shouting, "Mamo, Mamo."
Yeah. Heartbreaking but beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what I was going to say, what I heard, some my girlfriend is in Bulgaria right now, and
Hmm.
she met up with a friend's cousin, um, who I guess at some point when she had posted this poem on Facebook, and he was her friend, right? So he had taken the poem and he sent it. He had a connection to the family of
Mm.
the woman. So apparently he didn't know it was me. He didn't know the connection to her. He just thought of it, this poem, and he sent it to the family. So I just found that out this week that
Oh, wow.
they've seen the poem. It's you do all these things in poetry, you get excited about getting a poem accepted or whatever. But to me this is what it's about, right? This is more important than a
Yeah,
publication or something
yeah,
like that. So I was happy to hear that. Of
sure.
course, there's always the worry, like, oh God, I hope it must have been hard to read too, but
Yeah. And it's always great when you find out that some poem of yours really connected with someone.
yeah, you just don't know, right? You put it
You
out
never
there.
know. Yeah, yeah. I mean, a similar thing happened with me. I enjoy writing haiku, and I post some of them sometimes. And I got a message once from somebody who said, I would really love your haiku. It's beautiful. Actually, my niece or something just passed away, and I would
Oh,
like to read it at her funeral, if that's okay. So I was
wow.
like, "Are you serious?" In my poem,
Yeah.
is that important? And yeah, it's a great moment. It's a great
Yeah,
feeling.
that's a beautiful. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really. I mean, it's heart-wrenching, but it's
yeah, it's heart wrenching, but at the same time, you feel like, okay, it's a tragedy, but at least maybe for a few seconds or a few moments, I can add some beauty to the situation.
right. I mean, this is what it should be about, right? This is
Yeah,
what this is really. These moments are rare that you know about it, but that's way more important than to me
yeah,
than getting any publication, even though it's exciting or whatever. But that those are the moments of clarity where you go, okay, this is why I still do this thing,
right, right.
even when I'm frustrated or whatever. Um, then you get something like that, you hear something like that.
Sure. So, are you working on anything new? Your next book or publishing
I'm
something
just
new
trying
that's
to
beyond
write.
this?
I'm just trying to write poems.
Yeah,
It's going like this for now, but I have poems, but I got to give it some time away, and
sort of a
I don't know. I'm planning to just spend the next few years just, this is what I do. I don't plan a book, right?
yeah,
I just write poems, and then at some point I have a bunch of poems. And I go, okay, maybe there's a book here. Let's see what I got, and that happens every
yeah.
4 years or so, something like that.
So, have you published anything new lately that's not from the book?
I have a poem coming out in Rattle, uh, but not until the fall issue.
In the
So
fall. Okay,
yeah,
cool,
fall 2023. So
sweet.
they have a back catalog,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
new
Well, that's
poems.
the book. It's called Visitor. I highly encourage everyone to check it out because I love it, and I will be revisiting it. Pun intended with the title. I'm going to be a visitor frequently. Would you like to wrap up with one last poem before you go? And anything,
Yeah, yeah.
anything
Let
you
me.
want to read, or
What's that?
something you want to read?
Uh,
The Clint Margrave selection,
I'll pick this poem called "Once I Shared a Wall with God."
like that.
Um, the story of this, the inspiration for this was just living in an apartment with thin walls and having having nosy neighbors. So as much as we complained about them, I have to thank them now. At least I got something out of it.
You got something out of them,
This
yeah.
is one of the benefits of writing. It's like you can turn anything. Like, at least you can get something out of the worst things. Or that's not the
Right,
worst,
right.
the most annoying things, whatever it is. So it's one of those instances where it worked out. Once I shared a wall with God. I could hear him vacuuming late at night. Who does that? He was constantly rearranging furniture, opening and closing drawers, sliding hangers in the closet, banging things around. I never really heard his voice because he lived alone. Occasionally, just the deep rumble of him clearing his throat. It's not his fault, I told myself. The walls are thin. These floors crack at every step. The rooms are echo chambers. I can adjust. In the mornings, it was silent, godlike sleeping in. But at night, I cursed the world until I finally had to confront him. I thought about leaving a letter to spare us both the awkward conversation, but I wanted to make sure he understood. I'll be nice, I said as I rang his bell, but if it keeps on happening, I'll have to tell the landlord. Nervous as I was, I wanted God to know he'd been a bad neighbor, that he had little regard for others, that this universe was something we both shared. I'm sorry, I wanted to hear him say. I'm so sorry. But nobody answered the door.
Wonderful, wonderful. So who is God's landlord? That's kind of a profound
I don't know.
philosophical question.
Does God pay rent?
Well,
Maybe we are.
thank you so much, Clint. This has been wonderful.
All right, Clifford. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thanks
Great.
to everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Poetry Passages with Clint Margrave, poet and novelist. Check out his new book, Visitor, available from your favorite bookstore. And we'll see you again real soon, right here on Poetry Passages. Bye.